Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. There's a lot of media attention these days with Kim Davis in Kentucky, who refused to give a same-sex marriage license and went to jail and came out. And people have a lot of strong opinions about it, of course. I just saw on the news just the other day that a company called plantingpeace.org put a billboard in her hometown, and it says this. It's actually a quote from something else back from at least 2012, so it's a really old quote, but they put it on the billboard now. Dear Kim Davis, the fact that you can't sell your daughter for 3 goats and a cow means we've already redefined marriage. So the fact that you can't sell your daughter for 3 goats and a cow means you've already redefined marriage. I just wanted to say a few things about this because I think it might help us think clearly about these kinds of things. When I first saw that, I thought several things and felt several things. One is, oh my goodness, that's absurd. And it's unfortunate that people are so profoundly ignorant about the history of marriage, but also what they're talking about seems, I think, supposed to be implication for something from the Bible. That's probably the assumption, since Kim Davis says she doesn't give out same-sex marriages licenses because of her quote-unquote religion, and of course she's a Christian. So maybe it's implication from the Bible, but this is, of course, nowhere in the Bible does it say that you're supposed to get 3 goats and a cow for marriage. So one is, biblically, this is nonsense because there's nowhere in the Bible that it says that. And it's unfortunate that people don't look up biblical text first to realize it's there, but they don't, in the text, it doesn't say it's from the Bible. I'm just saying, I sure think that's the implication. Maybe not. Maybe I'm completely wrong there. The second thing I'd say is, what really stuck out to me is the fact that a person could, in certain cultures, sell their daughters away doesn't mean that marriage has been redefined. And that, of course, is the number one implication of the sign. That, Kim Davis, you're so bothered about redefining marriages. Well, and maybe in some cultures you can sell your daughter for animals. Therefore, it's already been redefined. Selling your daughter or son for animals doesn't mean marriage is now between the same gender or between a human being and an animal. In other words, marriage has nothing to do with the cultural peripheral issues surrounding marriage. In particular, this quote implies that there's a money gift. There's a gift that money, well, it's not money here, it's livestock, but in most parts of the world, especially in the ancient world, they didn't use money that much. Here, the point is that a person would get dowry. Now, dowry is used in almost all cultures on the planet, and it's been around forever and ever and ever and ever. Dowry is the gift that the bride's family gives with the bride. So, obviously, I'm married. My wife, let's say that my wife's parents, when we got married, gave my family money along with my wife. So I got a wife and some cash, and maybe a car, land and holdings and stock options or whatever they gave it. Now, the reason why it was so popular in the ancient world, and still is very popular in parts all over parts of India, particularly in China and different places, is it serves several purposes, and it depends on the culture. But in general, it is to help the married couple be married. Because, particularly, now let me think biblically, because that's what I want to focus on, not every culture on the planet. In ancient Palestine, particularly ancient Israelites, when a person got married, the woman, the bride, moved into the home of the man, and the man lived with the dad. So, imagine if, let's say it's me and my wife now, we're in the ancient world, my wife and I get married, I don't go off and live somewhere else. My wife comes to live with me, and I still live at home, or very close to home. And I certainly live under the authority of my father to some degree, and that means that we start racking up the bills. We have power bills and water bills and paying the cable and phone. We have bills to pay that we charge up, and that my father now has to pay. And so the money my wife brings with her is to help pay the bills. And that's a big deal around the world. So it's a safety net for the new family not to have an overwhelming expense. The other thing is dowry provides safety for the bride. It is very customary in ancient cultures, particularly Jewish cultures, to demand that the dowry be paid back to the family if something happens to the wife. So, for example, if I beat my wife which I never would in a billion years, but if I were to beat her, if I were to kill her, if I were to do something damaging to her, I have to give back all the dowry to the family. And the assumption was that when I first got the dowry and I spend it all up, I would, after, I don't know how much dowry it is, and maybe it takes a couple years to spend it up, but then I had no more money to pay back if something were to happen. So it's also protection against deadbeat husbands. It's almost like insurance money. Don't hurt my daughter. I give her away in marriage, but don't hurt her, because if you hurt her at all, you have to give us all the dowry money back, and I get my daughter back, of course, too. So dowry is a very common thing across the planet, and it still is in many parts of the world. So again, just now to go back to my point here earlier, dowry has nothing to do with how marriage is defined. Dowry is a custom that surrounds the marriage act itself. So there are two big issues already. One, if it is an implication of something in the Bible, it's nowhere at all to be found. There's nothing like this in the Bible. Two, if they're saying that dowry has to do with the definition of marriage, well, that's just silly, because marriage is not the same thing as the dowry. The dowry accompanies marriage in many parts of the world. A third problem with this quote, and I keep piling up, is, now this is not as clear to me, but it might be if it's implied. If the implication is that this was the way it was a long time ago, but now we do things differently, well, that's a fallacious argument. That is to say, the new is not necessarily better or right. And that's a common assumption people make all the time when it comes to anything in the post-Enlightenment world. We just assume modern is better. Modern is better. Any idea that comes from the past is almost always considered worse, passé, old school, stupid. And what used to be just in fashion, that is clothes from last season or last year, whatever, unless it's retro. But then it's new to be retro. But in other words, you don't want to just do it for old time's sake, because then you're past the times. That's why people love makeovers. But what used to be confined just to fashion is now given to all kinds of areas of life, philosophically speaking. And so, and scientifically speaking too, anything that's from before yesterday, it's just old and passé and ancient, including definitions of marriage. So again, if it's implied that new is therefore right just because it's new, or it sounds silly to you, well, that's a very poor argument. The other thing I'd say is this about this whole concept. When it says we've already redefined marriage, I don't know who the we is. I don't know who the we is. If it's we humans, the answer is, well, then that depends. Because there is no baseline. There's no absolute unanimous view of marriage in the world, or in the ancient world, by the way. But in general, the overwhelming majority of all cultures believe that marriage was defined as when a man and woman marry. Now, we have evidence that in some Greek literature and Roman literature, and of course in other cultures as well, that apparently same-gendered people could get married. For example, supposedly there's evidence, there's literary evidence, I'm not sure how much is trustworthy, but it seems to be the case that Emperor Nero, in fact, married two different males, one an older guy and then later on apparently a slave boy. But in general, we look at the evidence, they might have done those things as the emperor, but they would not have been recognized as a marriage by the Roman government, by the state. So they could force themselves into a relationship and call it marriage, but they weren't in fact married. And we find this across most cultures on the planet, that men and women, of course, are the standard definition of marriage, but not exclusively. Not exclusively. We have some cultures in different parts of the world where it was possible to have the same gender. It's just by far in the minority. One thing that people often make argument they make when it comes to marriage is to say that in ancient cultures, particularly biblical, they'll say they had several wives, called polygyny, many wives. Some cultures have polyandry, multiple husbands, but that's very rare. But certainly in the biblical times, we focus on that area. We have people who are married to multiple wives. We have a few examples, not many, but a few, and they happen with kings or very, very wealthy people like Abraham and, of course, Solomon and David. But in general, Jews did not practice polygyny. They did not have multiple wives, nor is it ever condoned or encouraged, and nor is it ever discouraged. The overwhelming majority, I'd say 99.99% apparently, of ancient Jewish people had monogamous relationships, one man, one woman, except for, again, royalty and very, very, very wealthy people who would have maybe a few wives. But again, the definition of marriage there is between a man and a woman. What is culturally dependent is how many women that the man is married to, or how many men the women are married to. So that's one thing to keep in mind when we talk about marriage. The definition of marriage, as typically defined in most cultures in the world, is between a man and woman. So those are just some quick highlights when I think about this billboard, how just, I'm being as kind as I can, overwhelmingly uncompelling and unconvincing the sign is to Kim Davis. That's, I'd say so far, all these things make that sign genuine nonsense. It's genuinely nonsensical. It genuinely is completely irrelevant to the discussion. All of it is. There's nothing on anything, implication or explicitly stated on the sign, or those kinds of arguments from people that make it compelling case about how marriage should be now. Okay? So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and now talk about when people make arguments about how marriage should be. That is to say, if I was going to make a billboard against Kim Davis's views of marriage, I would have done a lot better job than they did. I've done a whole lot better job by making arguments. But anyway, if someone wants to argue how marriage should be, you're making a moral argument. Now, I know many Christians, good, smart Christians, who think you can make non-religious arguments for same-gendered marriage. And by the way, make a little footnote here. It is not gay marriage. It is not gay marriage. It's not lesbian marriage. People are not marrying based on their sexual attractions. They're getting married based on whether or not they are simply human beings. It is irrelevant if I'm attracted to a man in order to get married. It is irrelevant if a woman is attracted to a woman to get married. To get a marriage license, you don't have to be attracted to them. You just need to fill out the proper paperwork. So while I've heard Christians argue for what they might call traditional marriage, using non-religious terms and arguments, I haven't found any of them compelling at all. And here's why. The term traditional, of course, seems to imply for a lot of people true, time-honored, trusted and true, and so forth. Well, my response is maybe. Maybe. It's also a tradition in the human race to steal and gossip and to lie and to do bad things too. I want to be non-traditional when it comes to sin. Or if you don't know that word, doing things God doesn't want. So I want to be very non-traditional. In other words, the word traditional doesn't mean moral. It means it's been done that way a long time. So the question is does it need to be changed, or is it okay to change it? So for me, when a person says we should not redefine marriage to mean between a man and man or woman and woman, because it is the traditional view for so long, I'm just saying I don't find that compelling. I don't think using the word traditional makes anything compelling. I know that might surprise you if you're a Christian listening to this, because that's the typical way people talk about it. I'm just telling you my view is that's not compelling at all to say, well, it's the traditional view, therefore it's the right thing to do. Instead, it seems to me that if a person's going to argue that man and man or woman and woman marriages should not take place, you must appeal to a worldview, or you might say religious worldview. You must do that. I don't see any way around it at all. And I'll give you I'll explain that a little more here. If I'm a naturalist, if I believe that all that exists is nature, or I'm some form of naturalist, and my worldview is there's no higher power at all, I am nothing but an evolved primate on a speck of dust in the middle of this galaxy, in the middle of nowhere of a universe. What possible difference does it make if a man and man want to get married? Or woman and woman get married? What possible difference? From their point of view, from a non-Christian's worldview, from that point of view, I absolutely agree with them. It makes no difference. It genuinely makes no difference. If a man and man and woman and woman want to get married, and then I'm a man and I got married to a woman, I don't see how a man and man's marriage or a woman and woman's marriage affects my marriage at all. I just don't see that compelling. People say, well, it devalues my marriage. It affects me somehow. Well, now society is going to fall apart at the seams. Well, I don't see why it will. But I just don't see why it will at all. My follow-up to that would be, but here's the conundrum, it seems to me, and that is, if you make the argument that it's completely okay for man and man and woman and woman to get married, then where would it stop? Because it's the classical slippery slope argument. If I say, because I do what I want to do and I love whom I want to love, well, then it should be, honestly, it should be consistent. It should be consistent where you can marry anything you want. And in some cultures, supposedly, you can. I mean, I've read news reports where a woman marries herself. I've read reports where people are forced to marry animals because they copulate with an animal. And that's in recent memory. So it's not like that's a fairy tale. It really happens. Well, at least you're being consistent. Because if you can marry the same gender, if the definition of marriage is a legally binding relationship, well, then you can have a legally binding relationship with anything you want. Go all in. And that inconsistency that cracks me up. I don't understand why people who are such advocates of same-gendered marriage are not consistent. They end up being profound hypocrites. Well, they'll talk so much about justice for all who look like me and act like me and are like me. And this reminds me of the day. Bruce Jenner, the man who had a sex change operation, was on Ellen DeGeneres, of course, who's a well-known lesbian. So here's Bruce Jenner with fake breasts and other things going on, who now looks kind of feminine, talking to a lesbian, and Bruce Jenner says he still does not support same-gendered marriage. He's on the Ellen DeGeneres show saying he believes in traditional definitions of marriage. So here's a man dressed like a woman telling a lesbian that he thinks marriage should be between a man and woman. And then he went on to say, they had a discussion, and then he went on to say, well, you know, if the word marriage is that big a deal to you, I guess, yeah, you go ahead, you should do it. Isn't that amazing? My point is, I was just blown away. So here's a poster child of the gay and lesbian community saying we should accept everybody, and he's the poster child, and then he doesn't accept, quote-unquote, non-traditional views of marriage. So he at least is not being consistent, but a lot of people are not consistent. It just seems to me, following the final up of this podcast, that for a Christian in particular, or even I guess if you're a Muslim in your worldview, but in a Christian's view, since we're right, since we hold the truth, what matters is what Jesus said. In Matthew 19, he says we have two options. You man and woman in marriage, or you become a eunuch, which, of course, is just a metaphor. Literally, it has literal implications, of course, but metaphorically, it means someone who's celibate. He says some people are eunuch by birth, that is, they just can't have children. They were born that way. He doesn't say it's a curse. He didn't say it's God's will. He says they're born that way. Some are forced that way. That is to say, they were children. They were usually eunuchs are people who didn't have men who were castrated, grew up in royalty, so they were not able to have children with the women, the princesses and so forth. That way they couldn't confuse who the children were, who's heir to the throne. Then there's a third category, Jesus says. Those are people who do it for the kingdom of God. These are people who choose not to get married just so they can dedicate themselves to the Lord's service. And that's it. He didn't say they're awesome. He didn't say they're better. He didn't say married people are better. Jesus at no time says marriage is better than everything else. And you should spend all your energy trying to find that special someone because God has that special someone. He doesn't say that. Instead, it's just more a matter of fact. There are two options. Some people get married, others don't. And that's it. Christians, it seems to me that before we're so busy chopping down other people's view of marriage, we should listen very carefully to what the worldview is. If they are a non-Christian, doesn't it make sense that you and I should not assume they share our values? Doesn't it make sense? Because they don't. They're evolved primates. What possible difference would it make? It seems to me that arguing and making a big fuss about it, I know it matters. I know it does. But being hateful about it and huge debates and arguments about that, it just seems to me is not going to make anybody a disciple of Jesus. Our job as Christians is not to make sure non-Christians concur with us and Jesus about how people should get married. Our job is to make disciples of Jesus. Let's show them Jesus, talk about Jesus, talk about our worldview, demonstrate and give evidence for why it's true, and then see what happens. And in the meantime, we'll keep spotting these billboards and seeing how they're nonsense. But Christians, let's don't say nonsense too. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. If you want to listen to more, go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and look at one of the tabs that says podcast. If you click that, it'll take you straight to my podcast on iTunes, or you can search for it on iTunes if you want to, A Glimpse of the Kingdom. But also my website, you'll see another way to get, if you're an Android listener on your phone or you just don't use Mac computers. Again, davidpendergrass.com, and click podcast. It'll take you exactly where you need to go, and you can subscribe from there and get this as often as you like, and also see my blogs and so forth. If you want to get me to come to your organization or church, otherwise to do some consulting, you need to go to davidpendergrassconsulting.com. davidpendergrassconsulting.com. You'll see the information there. If you want to reach out to me on Twitter, you can find me at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass.